insights from Brain Smart People Development, and you're listening to Rawthentic Leadership, a series of conversations, insights and inspirations with leaders who are real, raw and authentic. Today I bring you an insightful conversation that unpacks and demystifies some of the terminology around diversity and inclusion, explained brilliantly by Toby Mildon. Our conversation has many levels of depth and covers a broad area, which makes it the perfect resource for any manager or leader wanting to get to grips with this critically important topic, and also to hear from Toby's lived experience. And if you think that our ending is a little abrupt, that's because we spent too much time catching up before the recording, making Toby late for his next meeting. Enjoy. I met this month's guest when I went back to the UK for a couple of years. It was back in 2015. And at the time, he was Diversity and Inclusion Manager for the BBC and also project managed speakers to run workshops on various topics, of which I delivered a couple. And we later co-facilitated a workshop on habits of inclusion. At the beginning of 2019, Toby Mildon founded Mildon, a boutique diversity and inclusion consultancy focused on supporting organizations to implement diversity and inclusion more effectively. And this is the topic of our conversation today. It's the essence of inclusion in leadership. Toby, great to see you again, and a very warm welcome to Rawthentic Leadership.
Thanks, Claire. It's so lovely to see you again. And I can't believe that it was 2015 that we first met.
I know, that's a bit scary, isn't it?
It is. Time has completely flown by.
Oh, gosh. So before we sort of get into the normal way that I run the podcast and the questions, I was thinking maybe if we could try a slightly different approach to today, because I think that, well, I believe certainly I can, and I think we could all benefit from just getting greater clarity around some of the terminology used in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's very terminology rich, I think. So, and then maybe once we've done that, dive a little bit deeper into, D&I from your perspective, from what you're doing with organizations and leaders. Would that be okay?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good place to start.
Great, thank you. And look, if there's anything, caveat, hold my hands up here. If there's anything I say that can be potentially construed as what you term a micro-inequity, which we will cover in a little bit, or in any way reveals an unconscious bias in my language, you have my permission to call me out.
Yeah, no worries. And likewise, I often put my foot in it. So, if I say something, then feel free to highlight it to me as well.
Brilliant, great, we're even Stevens, lovely. Okay, so actually, no, hang on a minute. Before we go into that, I'd love for you to just share a little bit about who are you, who's Toby, and why are you so obviously passionate about this topic?
Yeah, so I spent the first half of my career actually working in technology. When I left university, I was an IT consultant for Accenture. I worked in healthcare technology, implementing software into hospitals. And then I ended up at the BBC as a project manager, redeveloping the news website, developing the BBC Sounds app, and a number of accessibility projects. And I I fell into diversity and inclusion by accident, really. So I used to work really closely with the leadership team of the technology department, and they were worried at the time about the gender imbalance that we had in tech. So only about 14% of our workforce were women, compared
Oh
to the
no.
rest of the BBC, which had a 50-50 gender split. So, I mean, this is a kind of a known issue in science and technology and
Yeah,
engineering
yeah.
sector. Um, so the leadership team basically created a plan to get more women into technology, and they needed a project manager to execute the plan. And I volunteered, and I
Ah,
suppose I was interested anyway because I've got my own lived experience of diversity and inclusion. I was
Mm-hmm.
born with a rare genetic neuromuscular disability, so I've been a wheelchair user all of my life, and I need 24-hour care. So I've had
Mm-hmm.
my own experiences of
Yeah.
inclusion and exclusion in the world of work. So there was always that interest there to begin with.
Yeah. Wow. And so what was the so you left the BBC and then was it Deloitte's that you went to work for?
Yes, I've been at the BBC for about 10 years. And
Mm-hmm.
a friend of mine, she's a leadership expert, and she said, if you're at an organization for 10 years, then you're officially institutionalized. And, that scared the crap out of me. So um, I decided to leave the BBC and go and work for Deloitte. But I mean, there was a more serious reason, and that was for me. I knew at that time that I really wanted to work in the diversity and inclusion space.
Yeah.
And the business case for diversity and inclusion at the BBC is rather straightforward. The BBC is a publicly funded body,
Mm,
and therefore it's really important that everyone in the UK sees themselves reflected in the content that the BBC produces.
mm-hmm.
Um, Whereas I was really intrigued as to why one of the big four accountancy firms were so invested in diversity and inclusion. But Deloitte also had much more of a focus on culture, creating a culture of
Ah.
respect and inclusion, as they put it.
And was there a catalyst? Was there an event, anything that happened, or you just woke up one morning and thought, right, I just want to create my own business?
Yeah, I suppose I always had a bit of an entrepreneurial bug in me.
Mm-hmm.
I've always been a bit of an entrepreneur. Um, Way back from when I was younger. I used to, when I was at school, I used to run the school tuck shop. I took over the disco committee. I got told off by the headmaster for making too much profit, which completely baffled me because I thought the whole point of running an enterprise is to make a profit. So
Oh,
how on earth can you make too much profit? So I was, I suppose I always had that kind of entrepreneurial bug
yeah,
inside me. Um, but I was working for Deloitte. I was happy working for the firm. We were doing some great work, some great projects. But part of me just felt like I wanted to make a bigger impact.
yeah.
Um, and the ability to work with multiple organizations. And also, I had a few creative projects up my sleeve. So I really wanted to write a book. And I felt that I needed to do that under my own steam.
Ah, brilliant, thank you. And we'll touch on the book as well throughout our conversation. Thanks, Toby. It's a really good background to set the scene. So let's go into our clarifying our terminology, because it's such a vast area. So I'm thinking the maybe I'd like to start by exploring the view that you share about the whole spectrum of diversity, because I think that this sets the scene well for the foundation of our
Yeah.
conversation. In particular, the iceberg analogy that you refer to in your book, I really like how you present that in inclusion growth. Can you speak to that, please?
Yeah. So I mean, diversity basically means our differences.
Hmm.
I mean, that's all it really means. We are all unique, different individual human beings. We all have different characteristics, lived experiences that we can bring to the world of work, and businesses that leverage our diversity are successful because they don't fall into groupthink. Um,
Yeah.
you can benefit from different perspectives, different experiences. Therefore, you can better respond to customer needs. You can be more innovative, more creative. Um, Loads of evidence, academic evidence, that diverse teams make better decisions.
Hmm.
Um, so there's a huge number of benefits. So the iceberg analogy that I often share with my clients is that where you can see 10% of the iceberg poking above the waterline. And these are often our visible
Mm.
characteristics, and often the ones that are enshrined in equality legislation. So in the UK, we've got the Equality Act, and there's 9 protected characteristics, for example. However, underneath the waterline, this represents about 90% of the iceberg that you can't see.
Mm-hmm.
And these are other characteristics and often invisible. So it could be whether you're an introvert or extrovert, for example.
Yeah.
It could be whether you grew up in the countryside or in the middle of a city. It could be whether you are a member of the LGBT community
Mm.
or not, or whether you have an invisible disability. And so it's such a rich tapestry of diversity that's kind of hidden beneath the surface.
So look, I'm already going off on a tangent here. So has diversity then been diversity as we think of it today? Has that been boxed in to certain demographics? And if it has, what's the impact of that?
Yeah, so a lot of leaders and organizations, they have a very limited view on diversity. So when they hear the diversity word, they think that, oh, it must be to do with one or two groups of people. It's about women in leadership, or women working in technology, or people from an ethnic minority background, or members of the LGBT community. So they have a very kind of like siloed and also hierarchical view of looking at diversity.
Mm.
um, and I like to get my clients to think more about the inclusion piece
Mm.
and what it means to make people feel like they're respected for who they really are, that they belong to the organization, that they feel empowered, that they have the ability to progress, um, and focus on that,
Yeah.
and to celebrate our differences. And for me, diversity is a given. In the UK, we live in a very diverse country.
Yeah.
um, Diversity is there. It's on our doorstep. Whether or not we choose to invite that diversity into our organization is a conscious act.
Yeah.
And leaders have to be really mindful of what barriers are created that's preventing people from entering the organization.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to park that one for a second and get back into our terminology because my head's going all over the place at the moment. So there was a term that I really like that you're using, which is micro inequity, that people might have heard of as microaggressions. And look, I'm gonna put my hand up here. Is that I'm probably full of these, and but I don't know what I don't know, and I want to know what I don't know so that I stop doing it. So
Yeah.
can you please speak to microaggressions, micro inequities, and if you've got lived experience of that, and how it impacts you? I think that would be really helpful, Toby.
Yeah, so a lot of people get tied up in knots about this, really.
Mm,
Micro inequities and microaggressions are, pretty much the same thing. But I'll explain the difference between it. So microaggressions are basically small bits of behavior that are disrespectful or undermine somebody, and we all do it at some point in our career.
yeah,
So a microaggression, for example, is like going to a meeting with a colleague, and you are more interested in what's going on your phone rather than giving your full attention to your colleague. So that's a microaggression. It's something that that we've probably all done, or we've been certainly on the receiving end of. A micro inequity is basically a small behavior, but it's kind of directed at a characteristic that we have,
mm-hmm,
be that our gender, our ethnicity, our disability, our sexuality. So quite often I hear people, um, so like women that I work with, for example, will often say that it's often assumed that they're going to go and get the coffee, or that they're the ones that are going to take the notes in the meeting.
Still today?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Far
Yeah,
out.
yeah. And or from an ethnicity perspective, it might be, I've got black colleagues where people just feel like it's okay to go up to a black woman and just touch their hair without permission.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
and so invading their personal space. Um, or working with a colleague who doesn't have like an English sounding name
Mm-hmm.
and mispronouncing their name,
Yeah.
or just saying, "Oh, is it okay if I just call you Sam?" Because, I can't be bothered to learn how to pronounce your full name properly. So those are examples of micro-inequities because they are linked to a characteristic somehow.
And so thank you for that, because you've really expanded the scope for me. And and what's your experience of um, uh, the people who are on the receiving end of this? What stops them from speaking out or respectfully challenging that microaggression, that micro inequity?
There's a number of reasons. One of them is just fatigue. So if you're constantly on the receiving end of
Yeah.
microaggressions, it can be quite wearing.
Mm,
And some people just go, you know what, I just can't be asked
mm,
to raise this again.
mm.
Um, Another reason is that because they are so small and fleeting sometimes, they're difficult to capture in the moment
Okay.
because because it passes so quickly. Um, and also there's a whole thing around psychological safety in organizations as
Mm,
well. That if you don't have that level of psychological safety to be able to call out or speak up, um, it's for some people it's easier just to stay quiet.
yeah.
Um, the other thing that's really common is that if you're on the receiving end of this, a lot of people start reporting that, well, maybe it's something to do with me. Maybe I'm the problem, rather than the behavior of other people or the culture of the organization that you're in.
Gosh.
And therefore, they start to kind of internalize it as I'm, there's a problem with me, that I'm in the wrong. And, and when that starts to happen, it really eats at people's
Yeah.
confidence. And then it really affects people's mental health.
So when you're working with organizations and you bring this up as a topic, are they surprised and embarrassed that they're doing it, that it's been an unconscious behavior? And if so, how do you help people to break that habit and raise that level of consciousness?
So people are not surprised because I first start to talk about the micro aggressions that we all have probably received
Hmm.
or done, like paying more attention to your phone than to the person that you're meeting with. And so often people are like, oh, yeah, I get it. I've been in that situation. My boss has done that to me. So I totally understand.
Hmm.
And I understand the impact of that behavior on how I feel. And then I take it up a notch and I go, now imagine that you're receiving certain behaviors because of your ethnicity, or because of your visible disability, or because of your sexuality, or because of your gender or gender identity. And then people are like, okay, yeah, now I can start to see, I can start to see how that happens.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I was coaching somebody last week, and they shared with me that there was somebody in their team who identifies as non-binary, has a goes by a name that we would typically label as a female name,
Yeah,
and when he was talking about this person to the leadership team, he kept saying her and she, and he was corrected. And look, he he wasn't aware of the impact he was making. But then he said, how do I break this? How do I break this habit? And I said, you've got to bring it to conscious awareness. You've got to practice
Yeah,
it. I don't know. I mean, what tips would you have, Toby?
it's a difficult one, and I think you're right. You have to bring it into conscious awareness because it's like any habit. We can create new habits. Um, there's been plenty of books written on how we form new helpful habits. If you
Mm,
want to eat better or smoke less or drink less or go to the gym more. So I think um, we can follow those same kind of principles.
mm,
But it starts with awareness and wanting to make a change.
yeah.
And I think to be kind to yourself in a way as well, to say, you know what, I put my foot in it. I'm only human. I make mistakes, but I'm going to live and learn, and I'm going to move on, and I'm going to be a better person afterwards.
I'm so glad you said that, because what we agreed was that to sort of be upfront at the start and say, if I slip, pull me up. It's not my intention, and I really do want to, to make this change for good. And I'm
Yeah.
curious as well. So when we co-facilitated that workshop, you're in a wheelchair. I am extremely short. So there's never a situation where I have to bend down to speak to you. But what's the etiquette? Say you're in conversation with someone who's quite tall. Um, what's the etiquette?
I think the key thing is just to ask the person who
Yeah,
you're talking to. Because I can't remember if my wheelchair did this when we first met, but my wheelchair actually goes up and down.
yeah,
So at its highest point, I'm almost at kind of eye to eye level with somebody who's kind of average
yeah.
height. So yes, you could have sat down to talk to me so that we're on the same level, but equally I could have raised my chair
You didn't
to
need.
be at the
You
same
didn't
level
need
as you.
to.
Did I not do that?
You didn't need to. I'm not sure.
All right. I could have raised it a tiny bit.
Okay, that yeah. God, it's so simple, isn't it? Just ask. Just
Just
ask.
ask. Yeah.
Thank you. Um, okay, I'd like to ask you as well about representation, and what that means, and and what it means if we think about it in business, and as a again as a conscious strategic objective. And when I say business, I mean that can be commercial, not for profit, government, or what have you. Can you speak to us more about representation?
Yeah. I mean, representation is so important because it makes people feel like they are seen and heard and that they have a place in the organization. So when somebody joins a business and they look up at the senior leadership team and they don't see themselves reflected at that senior level, they often feel like, I just I don't have a future in this organization.
Yeah,
There's no one like me running the business. So
yeah,
how can I get promoted to that level? That's often like a subconscious thought that people have. Um, and similarly, just in everyday walks of life, if we don't see ourselves reflected in the media, for
yeah,
example, it's almost as if we're invisible.
yeah.
Um, so I think it's really important that we make sure that we have genuine, authentic representation of as many of us as we possibly can.
And gosh, there's a long way still to go, isn't there?
Yeah, there's a huge amount of bias, unfortunately, that's in the world that then infiltrates our politics, our businesses, our media, and we, as I think, as a human species, we need to be a lot more aware of these
Hmm.
biases and try to mitigate them.
So when you're working with a client, say you've got the opportunity to have this sort of conversation with a senior leadership team or an executive leadership team, if we can get access to them, um, how how do they respond in these conversations, and what sort of actions do they consciously look to take?
Yeah, I mean, organizations that I end up working with are invariably completely open to the idea of talking about diversity and inclusion and wanting to make improvements
Yeah,
and wanting to
yeah.
make decisions. I don't end up I think the very nature of the working in the consultancy space is that I don't work with companies that are closed to the idea because
Mm,
they wouldn't have me in anyway.
mm,
So, but even when I am in organizations that are open and receptive, I do still come across quite a lot of, let's call them barriers,
mm,
to progress. And I think one of the things that I come across a lot is fear. There's a huge amount of fear, um, about saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing, causing offense,
yeah,
and that can often lead to inaction because people don't want to
yeah.
be bold. They don't want to lean into that vulnerability as a senior leader and have difficult conversations with people.
Yeah, I hear you. It's the one, yeah. It's the ones how do we get access to those organizations who don't see it as a problem?
Yeah, and I think I have to do a lot of education, and I create lots of content that I put out on LinkedIn and do lots of webinars and
Hmm.
a huge amount of like content, and the whole reason for doing that is we have to educate businesses so that they get to the point where they're like, okay, we're ready to do something about this.
Yeah,
We now see the problem,
yeah,
we see the risks, and we see the opportunity, and we're ready to actually
yeah.
do something about it.
Okay. And actually, that sort of links quite well with my next question. So, my guest in last month's podcast, um, the um, the theme was around meaningfulness, and she was talking about greenwashing and rainbow washing. And
Mm.
I'm just curious: is there such a thing as diversity washing that goes on, and if it does, how do you spot it, and what's the impact?
Oh yeah, there's a huge amount of it going on. Um, there's the rainbow washing, there's the pink washing, there's the purple washing, which is for disabled people. Disabled people have adopted purple as their official color, apparently. Um, so there is a lot of that going on. I mean, I like to just call it window dressing,
Yeah.
and there's a huge amount of organizations that they create lots of comms about how inclusive they are, that they really value diversity, but the um the experience of staff in the organization is that it's not an inclusive place to work. And on my own podcast, I actually interviewed somebody called Sally, who at the time she was head of diversity and inclusion for EY,
Mm-hmm.
and she says, she was calling it the rhetoric gap. Um, and EY actually changed their policy to not enter awards, um, because she felt that some diversity and inclusion awards were really just about raising your profile. They weren't really about sustainable change.
Yeah.
Um, and therefore trying to get people trying to get EY colleagues to be able to talk online and at conferences about what it's like to work for the firm rather than try and go out and win awards.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. And actually,
Yeah.
we're probably on to our last sort of terminology bit then, in terms of you 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 differentiate calling out and calling in. Tell us more about that, Toby, please.
Yeah, so again, it's kind of the same thing really, but different approaches, and also depending on how comfortable you feel doing it. So calling out and calling in is how you respond when you notice non-inclusive behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say, for example, like you and I are in a meeting, and I notice that um, I'm gonna use loads of stereotypes here, Claire, unfortunately. But let's
Okay.
say you and I are in a meeting,
Yeah.
and I notice that the guys in the room keep talking over you because like you're the only woman in the meeting, and then you share an idea in the meeting and you don't get credit for that idea, but then one of the guys basically says your idea and then he gets the credit for it, and this happens quite a lot. And again, it's examples of microaggressions. So calling out would be where I might just put my hand up and go say and say, hang on a minute, everyone. Claire, Claire's just shared a really great idea, and but so and so's just taking
Yeah.
credit off for that. Or hang on, everyone, I've noticed that whenever Claire speaks up, everyone just talks over her, and she can't get her point
Yeah.
across. Um, Now that I've just said that, that feels very direct, and it might actually make you feel quite uncomfortable. So that's kind of the judgment that we have to be able to make. So that's kind of calling out. It's like you speak up and you say what you notice in the moment.
Yeah.
Calling in, which is my preferred style, just because of the way that I like to operate, is where I kind of check in with you, um, or I might check in with the chair. So in the coffee break, I might come up to you and I might go, Claire, I've noticed that whenever you um, put an idea across, somebody else is taking credit for that, or I noticed that people keep talking over to you or talking over you. Like, how do you feel about that? So I'm trying to show a bit more empathy.
Yeah.
Um, or I might pull the meeting chair to one side and I might say, by the way, I don't know if you've noticed, but whenever Claire um, speaks up, some of the other guys just talk over her. As chair, could you be a bit more mindful of that
Yeah.
and try to make sure that Claire gets her voice heard? So that's calling in,
Great.
and that's my preference, really.
Thank you. And funnily enough, that has happened to me in the past. And to be able to, and so if we take meetings as an example, to have some sort of check-in at the end. How did we go? Did we speak over each other? Did we take credit for something? That it becomes part of the general meeting etiquette, for example, or that we start to talk about how we communicate with each other. That then just becomes the norm.
Yeah, I mean that's a really good idea, and it rings a bell. Actually, I think one of my clients created a meeting checklist of how to run effective, and that
Yeah.
included inclusive meetings, and it was just to set that etiquette at the beginning of the meeting.
Mm. Yeah. Thanks, Toby. I suppose I want to move on to, um, I suppose it's like a massive question about where does D&I sit in the organization? And I, if you can share, if we maybe go back to your example at the BBC, and what was the stance, what was the role of senior leadership or the CEO that actually made a difference in diversity, equity, and inclusion being taken seriously, being championed? Can you speak more to
Yeah,
that?
yeah. So very often, the diversity and inclusion is seen as a HR department's
Mm,
responsibility, and it's often the responsibility is put on the shoulders of the head of HR. And it's something I do talk about in my book because I've got experiences of diversity and inclusion being owned by different parts of the business. So when I was working in technology at the BBC, the D&I plan was owned by our chief operating officer, and I thought that was a great move because diversity and inclusion cuts across all aspects of business.
Yeah,
It's not just a people issue.
yeah,
You need to be thinking about things like how much diversity do you have in your marketing campaigns? Therefore, marketing have a stake.
yeah,
How inclusive are your offices and your buildings? So again, whoever runs your offices or your workplace, they have to have a stake in the agenda. Um, so it cuts across all businesses, and I think unfortunately when it's based in the HR department, it's very much focusing on the people agenda,
yeah.
and it's and the HR departments are not very good at collaborating with the marketing department or the procurement
Hmm.
department or the IT department, um, who need to be involved in the conversation.
So you're helping people to see those interdependencies, that working across verticals, across silos, and taking that more holistic approach.
Yeah, and I mean that's why I wrote the book Inclusive Growth,
Yeah,
because I actually wanted to reframe diversity and inclusion in the minds of leaders that if you get it right, it will only help your business grow and prosper. And one of the first questions that I ask any organization when I start working with them is, how do you want to grow as a business? And then they tell me. And then I go, so how do you now see diversity and inclusion accelerating that growth or helping you outperform that growth? And then they start to then connect the dots. They're like, oh
right.
yeah, actually, if we have a diverse workforce or if our culture is inclusive, then we can grow in this way or the other.
Yeah. And who that we may know of, who do you see as role modeling this, as doing it really well?
So unfortunately, I would say there's no organization that has solved everything.
Mm,
There's there's probably examples of good practice dotted all over the place, different industries, different businesses, different parts of the world. Um, I wish there was a golden standard, but
yeah.
unfortunately there isn't.
What would it? I'm putting you on the spot here. I've gone completely off track of any of the questions I was going to ask you. Um, in your experience, what would that? What would it take to achieve that
Um,
golden standard?
so really, I think it's about focusing on equity, um, and inclusion, and less on the diversity,
Yeah.
which sounds a bit ironic, but loads of organizations say we want more diversity in the business. But the
Why
thing
do
is,
they want it?
they're focusing on the wrong end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
We have to start at the bottom of the pyramid. We have to, first of all, focus on equity. And what I mean by equity is that I think there's a mistake. People often feel like we have to treat everybody the same in order to be fair. But the thing is, because we're all unique individuals, we can't treat everybody the same. We
Yeah.
have to treat everyone as an individual and
Yeah.
give individuals what they need in order to thrive. And that's the equity piece. Once we've achieved equity, we've then got equality, because you and I are then able to compete on a level playing field.
You know.
Once we've achieved equality, we then need
Yeah.
to make sure that we've got inclusion and belonging in place.
You've just reminded me about, it's probably very overused, but it just comes to mind, that lovely image of the three kids trying to look at was it a cricket match or something? And equity,
Yeah,
if they all had the same size box, and if it would be me at 4 foot 10 3/4, I still wouldn't be able to see over the fence.
yeah, excellent. Yeah, that it's a really great graphic that explains the difference between equality and equity.
So, I mean, one of the things that, or not one, but something that keeps coming up at the moment in terms of management and leadership in organizations is uh, how much more complex it's becoming, that leaders are burning out, is how and I'm not thinking best how to frame this question, but how do you help them, I suppose, to see that the return on investment, that because it sounds like, oh shit, I've got another whole load of stuff to focus on. Do you get
Yeah,
that pushback at all?
I do. Yeah, yeah, I do. Be- and it comes back to mindset really, that a lot of people think that diversity and inclusion is like this extra thing that you have to do,
Yeah.
this extra activity, this extra work. And when you're a busy senior leader, you've already got enough pressure on your plate, and your to-do list is longer than you can cope with.
Mm.
Um, and and then it's like, well, and we've got to do this thing called diversity and inclusion. But uh, there's 2 points to this really. One, I think organizations need to understand how this just should be integrating into the way that we do business.
Yeah.
Um, and it becomes part of the fabric of your organization. And I often liken it to health and safety. Certainly in the UK, health and safety has become just part of business. Everyone knows what their responsibilities are. Everyone knows what to do if they spot a risk. Everyone, you know, if there's an incident that happens, you respond
Mm.
appropriately. You might even do an investigation to make sure that it doesn't happen again, and then you put in all the measures to make sure that everybody's kept safe. And that's just now normal business. So
Yeah.
I would love diversity. Your previous question was about, well, what does the golden standard look like? I mean, I'd like diversity and inclusion to become as mature as
Yeah.
health and safety. Um, the other point to the answer really is that leaders have to be really clear on the why. And to steal the words of Simon Sinek, he says, start with your why.
Yeah.
And again, this is one of the first exercises that I do with leadership teams. I get them to understand their why, because the why is unique to every business.
Mm.
And they need to be able to have 2 or 3 reasons why diversity and inclusion is important to
Yeah.
them.
And for that to be a conversation that's had throughout the organization and not just the leadership team.
Absolutely. It starts with the leadership team, because they're the ones that set the tone for the organization, and have to it has to cascade down
Mm.
from there.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. um there's something that I want to talk about is actually around disability. I'm moderating a panel discussion next week, and it's around DE&I priorities. And I was having a meeting today with the panel members, and something that one of them said resonated with me, because it's something that you put in your book as well, about that disability seems to be, I suppose, for want of a better expression, at the bottom of the pile when it comes to prioritizing. Why, and what can be done about it? Why disability?
Yeah, there does seem to be a bit of a hierarchy when it comes to diversity and inclusion. So a lot of organizations, they've got it. They'll focus on one or two particular groups. So they'll say, oh yeah, yeah, we're all about diversity and inclusion, and our priority right now is women in leadership or women in tech. And then next year we're going to focus on being an anti-racist organization, and we're going to create our ethnicity action plan. And then the year after that, it's all about mindfulness. And then the year after that, we're going to go out and save some whales. And then eventually we'll get around to doing disability. I hear that a lot. Um,
Oh,
I it is. I don't know why. I think it's something to do with the human psyche. I think it's something to do with, we like to put things into boxes. We like to characterize things, and we like to label things,
mm,
and it's our way of making sense of the world.
yeah,
And if somebody meets me for the first time, they're going to put me in the wheelchair user box,
yeah,
because it's that's my visible
yeah,
characteristic. Um, the problem with then attaching that label is that we then make all sorts of all sorts of assumptions or presumptions or stereotypes about that individual. As Verna Meyer puts it in her TED Talk, we make up stories about people before we get to know them.
Yeah.
And this is really the root cause of our kind of implicit biases.
Yeah.
And I think that's what happens. Whereas I like to get my clients to shift towards more about inclusion and equity, and then hope that the diversity is that, the final outcome of that.
Yeah. It sounds to me like it's putting the horse and cart in the right order. Toby, on that note, thank you so much. I have thoroughly enjoyed reconnecting with you and our conversation, and you have given us so much food for thought.
Thanks, Claire. I've really enjoyed chatting with you.
Yeah, same here. Go well, Toby. Thanks for listening, and we hope that this conversation provided the insights and inspiration that you were looking for. We're on a mission to get the key messages about modern day leadership out to as many people as possible. So look, if you do listen regularly or enjoyed any of the episodes, please head over to your regular podcast platform, subscribe and give us a positive review. You can also find Rawthentic Leadership on YouTube on the Being Brain Smart channel. And before you go, if you'd like to know what I do when I'm not interviewing amazing guests, I facilitate, train, speak and coach on the neuroscience of leadership and change. To find out more, head over to the Brain Smart website. That's brain-smart.com to find out more about some of our programs, or email me. That's Claire, CLARE, @brain-smart.com. Go well, and thanks again for listening.